I was here last year, and I think I gave a talk on Google extension, assistant actions. And so that was a pretty cool talk. Anyone built any assistant bots yet? Yeah, this is why no one uses them. It's garbage. No, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. It's just that the framework is so limited. Like, you have to respond in like 10 seconds and all sorts of crap. So they'll have a long way to go. All right, we'll give it one more minute, and then we'll start. I'll just keep bantering. And how many people have used Flutter here? Great, a couple. That's great. That's awesome. And how many are Android developers? Awesome. And then what about iOS? Boo. No, I'm joking. I like iOS. As a development platform, not as an OS. It's pretty garbage. Okay, so I guess we're just gonna start, and then if we get an adapter, we'll fix it. So hi everyone, I'm Faisal, flying around with those phones. You can follow me on Twitter, where I'm active the most, or email me, where I'm active second most, I guess. So who am I? I'm a Google developer expert. I'm also a senior engineer at Zoom.ai. We're an automated assistant for large enterprises. Completely not Flutter related. Actually, that's totally in the AI space, so that's what I do most of the time during my day, NLP and all that stuff. But so this is the story of where Flutter came from, and this is really Flutter for Android developers. So let's take a step back to see where Flutter came from. And the story begins October 26th, I think, in Munich, and I'm hanging around. Oh, do we get an adapter? No? Okay, whatever, we're starting with this. So I'm hanging around in Munich at this conference called Dart Conference. I think it was called Dart Conf, or Dart Summit, actually. And so we're sitting in the front row, because I'm a nerd, and I sit right there. And I'm looking up, and I'm watching all these talks, and one of the talks at the end is like the secret talk. And I'm all excited, because I've been an Android developer for the longest time, since like the beta 1 days or whatever, when Android had like this really crappy looking home screen and didn't even have a keyboard. Anyone remember when Android did not have a soft keyboard? Oh my God, it did not have a soft keyboard till like 1.5. And I remember sleeping in a bunk bed with my brother on top and waking him up at night and going, Android now has a keyboard. But anyways, so I've been doing Android for a long time since then. And so while I was at Munich, this Dart conference, they said there was a secret talk, and I thought they were going to make Dart the official language for Android. And I was very excited. I was like, great, I really like Dart, and I'm going to do this. And I was all ready. And the guy comes on, Eric Seidel, I think. That's how you pronounce his last name. And he comes on and he talks about this project they have going on called Sky. And he shows like this, I think it was like a box floating around and a weather app. And he says, this is a Dart app. And at first, my heart is crushed because I think this is like a Cordova thing. And I'm like, no, you can't do a cross-platform nonsense like Cordova. It's gonna like be ugly, right? You know, like all the stupid performance stuff you run with HTML, with Cordova, and all sorts of crazy stuff that we used to do. And so then he says, no, this is actually native. And I'm intrigued. I wonder how this is native. And the story is that what they did, stepping back probably a year before, Google has a big issue internally, and the issue is they have a lot of apps, right? More apps than we actually see, and they're constantly giving tools to their sales staff and everyone else for these apps, and so they constantly have to update them. And having a development team, an Android development team assigned to that, and an iOS development team assigned to that is a lot of work. And they don't want to tell their employees, hey, you have to use Android. And so they're building these apps, and it's a long development cycle. And sometimes what happens is, as with any other cross-platform app that anyone has, a feature not on parity or whatever, where you have iOS has some features, Android has some features, and you're not in sync anymore. And so they started looking at cross-platform development frameworks, right? And they looked at a lot of them. And the way Google works internally is they make this big matrix. And they say, okay, so this app, this is what the problem we're trying to solve, and these are all the possible solutions we have right now. And so they listed tons of solutions that exist on the market, and even internally, that we can probably use. Anyone remember GWT? Yes, that craziness. That was on that tool too. So maybe we can take GWT and stick it on mobile. Great. Maybe we can build something like Java, but for iOS, or make a cross-compiler. There's actually a cross-compiler. If anyone uses Inbox, the Google Thing app, they actually have a Java to Objective-C compiler that they have internally. It's open source, and what you can do is actually take your Java and convert it to Objective-C. And so that's how they built Inbox. There's a whole blog post on it. It's probably lost somewhere. But anyways, they thought about this and they said, there's an internal language being used a lot called Dart. And it's being used by the AdWords team and AdSense team. And so let's take a look at Dart. And this language seems very productive and very fun to use. And what can we do with this language? So they started to look at rendering engines. And they said, well, we have the best rendering engine, at least they think, alive, which is the Chrome rendering engine, right? Chrome renders videos beautifully, fonts, everything it does really well. So how can we take the Chrome rendering engine and put Dart with it? And so they stripped out HTML, CSS, all the DOM stuff, everything, and they ended up with this Skia layer that actually renders the UI components. And so they started using Dart and basically writing to this render tree. And that's how this idea of Sky came along. I don't know why it's called Sky. Maybe it was just like this blue sky thinking that it's going to work one day. And it did work, but then Flutter came along. And at the end, I'll tell you where the name Flutter comes from. So that's what happened. And so that became this whole revolution that started for Dart, where Dart was a great language for the web. It had terrible PR. I don't know who their PR was that said we're going to kill JavaScript. That was like the death. That one article destroyed Dart in one shot. You never say you want to kill JavaScript. So they said that. No one liked it anymore. Everyone Hacker News hated it, those people. And so then what happened is Dart had this nice little community around Angular and also on the back end. And so with Flutter, Dart got this second life, and now it's become very popular where a lot of people are paying attention to Flutter and subsequently Dart. So that's where the story comes from. And the idea behind Flutter was we're going to make this 60 frames per second. This is going to be native Android and iOS. This is not going to be some smoke and mirrors trick where it looks like, hey, this is an Android app. No, it's just a web app. It's not none of that, right? It's not a web view. There's no component of web in this. There's no DOM, like HTML, DOM, CSS, none of that. And the principles for Flutter are fast, beautiful, and natural. And the fast comes from the 60 frames per second. The beautiful comes from this idea of material design, that they're going to implement material design right down to the perfect pixel spec. And in fact, at Google, I don't know now, not that the Flutter team's grown so much, but initially, the material design team sat right next to the Flutter team. So whenever they built these components, the material design designers, looked at microscope and said, you're off by a pixel, and all sorts of stuff, right? And so they really, really made this perfect. And so if you look at actually the material design components that Flutter has, there's actually some that Android and iOS don't even have yet, right? That Google hasn't done there, just because they're putting so much effort on this. And the last part is the most key part. They could have said Flutter's just going to be ugly and we could have designed a nice app, but the last part is the most key part, which is natural, right? Because you have a fast app, but it has to behave natural. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you take a list view, right? On Android, when you scroll a list view, you have this nice little blue glow that happens. On iOS users are not expecting a blue glow. They're expecting a weird jelly fling effect, right? And so if you build a web app and you really optimize it on one platform for for example, Android, you'll get that nice CSS blue glow, but then your iOS users will be confused and it won't feel, even if you get the physics working, it won't feel like an iOS bounce, right? Or vice versa. And so Flutter, basically, if your app, is running on an iOS device, it's going to behave exactly like an iOS device. It's going to have all the user experience that users expect. For example, on iOS, you can just swipe the view controller, the activities across the screen. You can do that. On Android, you won't be able to do that, right? with a Flutter app, and vice versa. And so Android users expect the back button working and the right animations. You won't get that on iOS. So that's really where fast, beautiful, and natural comes from. So I'm going to show you a quick demo of a Flutter app. And the way you build Flutter is using IntelliJ or Visual Studio Code, or if you're crazy enough, Vim. Don't know why you want to torture yourself like that. I have a developer at work who just loves to use Vim, and I don't understand. I'm just like, man, you're wasting time. All right, so it's going to create a Flutter project, and what it's really doing right now is it's just going out and making sure the Flutter is updated, and it's going to run this thing called pub. What the hell is that? It's going to run pub get, and it's going to install dependencies. So just like on Android, we have Gradle. Pub is their version of Gradle almost. It's like an NPM package manager, and it will automatically go ahead and install everything for you. And so here, I want to make sure my ID is configured correctly here. It's pointing to the right instance. All right. Because I've been playing with all these different versions of IntelliJ, my Flutter instance always points to the wrong place. So Flutter SDK, great, apply. All right, cool, that should work. All right, awesome. So what we have here, don't worry about the code right now. We won't look at that. What's really important is just this folder structure. As an Android developer, we're used to Gradle's folder structure, right? Can everyone read this properly? Just the UI there? Okay, no? Okay, let me change the screen resolution a bit. Display, scaled. Let's try 720p. All right, now you guys definitely can see this. No, you can. Everything's black. Oh no, definitely. All right, cool. So everyone should be able to see this. When a Flutter project is created, you have an Android project and an iOS project. So it's just an Android project. There's nothing special about it. There's just some Gradle configurations built into it. But if you want to open this up in Android Studio, there's nothing stopping you, right? It probably won't compile because there's some dependencies that are missing that need the outer project. But you can actually go in and write your own Java classes. You can import your stuff from other projects if you want to interface it with Flutter. Typically, you won't have to do that unless there's a very, very specific use case that you need a plugin. For example, all the Firebase plugins, if you need like a touch sensor plugin, Flutter doesn't support all this. What Flutter does is just exposes a way for the operating system to talk to it. And so you can write native Java code and native iOS code, and then Flutter will just chat with it, right? And so if you open this up, you got your source file, you got your main Java, main activity, right? And this is just the main activity here. Simple, right? If you look at it, it extends Flutter activity. And if I download the Flutter source code and just attach it to this, I can actually see all Flutter activities doing internally is doing like a set content view with this layout that has a Flutter view. So that's what's very interesting about Flutter. At the end of the day, it's just a Flutter view, right? And so if you think about what you can do with the view on Android, you can do that with the Flutter view. So there's actually a big company in Toronto, millions and millions of downloads. They're looking to convert their app into Flutter. I think they have like 100 million downloads. And so they don't want to just tell the development team, all right, file a new project, let's do this. They want to slowly migrate over. And what they're doing is they're using their own Android project, and they're adding Flutter view page by page, right? And that's how they're getting across. And there's some documentation on Flutter that does this. I would recommend not doing it yet because it's still very early on and it's pretty crazy. If you're doing a Flutter app, just start with scratch. And the same goes for iOS, but we won't talk about that. And so what we can do here is either open it up in an Android emulator or iOS simulator. I'm just going to open up Android simulator only because the emulator will take ages to open up. And but it doesn't matter, it's the same concepts. And that's what's great about this, is the same code that's being compiled. If I were to open this up on Android, Gradle build would run. And on iOS, it's just Xcode build is running, but it's taking the same code and just deploying it. So we're going to do that. We're going to head back over. We're going to close this. We're going to head back over to our main file here. And this is one of the key concepts of Flutter that is really, really nice. I'm going to run this. And if you see at the bottom, it's going to do launching lib/main on iPhone X in debug mode. It's going to go ahead and run Xcode build. Later, during the talk, I'll just run it on Android Simulator, and you can see just the same thing, except it runs Gradle build. So it's going to run Xcode build, and it's going to launch this right here. Cool. So there we go. App is launched, device synced, and you have a really simple, basic-looking app. On Android, it will look exactly the same. And actually, as I talk, I'll just open it up in the simulator. Why not? And so, oops. Okay. And so one of the core concepts of Flutter is this idea of hot reload. And people before me mentioned this. And I'll show you it in action. And this is what, as an Android developer, really makes me happy. Because as I'm doing Android development, you have to, if you're down 3 levels, sure, you have that instant run, but sometimes instant run doesn't work properly. And instant run is only good for just launching these activities. It's not persisting state many times. It's doing all sorts of weird stuff. Whereas hot reload, it just works. So, you make a blue app, and your developer comes to you, your designer comes to you, and your designer's like, it's not, our company logo isn't blue, it's actually red. And you're like, oh shit. So what would you do? What would you do on Android, right? You would go to your r.xml, .colors or whatever, change it, hit run, it would wait, it would build while they're looking at you like, how would you not know our company colors are blue, right? And it's very, very awkward. Whereas on Flutter, what you can just go is, hey, okay, I'm going to change this to red, save it, and then the app changes to red right there, right? And it's all native, and it just works. Now, what's nice is, if you made a mistake in your implementation detail, for example, you would have to restart and all your variable state is lost. For example, I'm going to change this button to whatever, 19, and now I'm going to change this color again to purple, right? You would see that the 19 stays. The variable state stays. It doesn't matter if it's an integer, string, or whatever, or if you made like 10 API calls and you have all this JSON data, that data is going to stay. And so you can actually manipulate that data dynamically too, where instead of me saying every time I press this button, it should do +1, I can go in and I can change the increment count, the actual implementation algorithm here, to go counter is equal to counter times 2, right? I'm going to save it, and now every time I press plus, it's going to do counter times 2, right? And now I'm like, oh, I made a mistake. It should be counter times 3, right? Save it, done. So this whole flow as an Android developer, even as an iOS developer, would have taken a long time to build, right? Because you have to stop it, restart, and all sorts of stuff would happen in the middle. And if you were already logged in and like 5 pages deep, you would have to go through that whole process again just to get to the screen where you want to change one implementation detail. This is actually great when you're doing API development, because when you make an API call and you don't parse the headers properly, you don't have to go, okay, let me restart my app, fix the headers properly, and work on it. You can just change the header and hit that API call again, right? So speeds up the flow a lot. Any questions? No? Okay. We'll do more questions at the end. And so how do I do view present? Right? And so high level, Flutter is just built like this. They have this material layer at the top. That's this, and then you also have this Cupertino layer if you want, and you have a custom layer. You can make your widgets go crazy, and I'll tell you guys to download an app later. Ugliest app ever, but it's built in Flutter, and you can see how much you can customize it. And so right after a couple slides, we'll get to there. And then you have your widget layer, and then you have your rendering, and you have an animation layer, painting, gestures, services, right? So all this is all done in Dart, and what's nice about that is you can control all this if you want. This is just like Android, where you can get really deep, low level, and really customize how something looks. And so, for example, if you look at gestures, because in Flutter, there's this idea that everything is a widget, And we won't really dive deep into it, but just think of it as like building blocks, where you can take one Lego block and put it on another Lego block and on and on and on. Everything in this thing that you see right here in the green is technically more or less a widget, right? With the exception of services and painting, which is just like this layer that's being drawn. Animations are widgets, gestures are widgets, everything's a widget here. So you can take a gesture widget and you can wrap it in anything you want, right? So on Android, I know many times I run into issues where I'm like, oh, it doesn't add on click, right? And I should have to go override on click and add some tap listener and really change the implementation method there, create my own custom view just to get a simple stupid tap working. Here, I can just take my gestures and I can wrap it into anything. I can go, all right, imagine I have an image and I just want a swipe right on an image, right? On an Android, an image view does not support swipe right. I would have to have a custom image view that supports swiping right. Now I can just take that widget, the gesture widget, I can wrap it in my image view on Flutter, and I can say, on swipe right, do this, or on swipe, and then just check if the direction's right. It's done. So it's a widget. You can take, it's just building blocks. So it's very easy where you can say, I'm going to take this block, attach it to this block. And everything takes a child, everything takes a widget as a child, so you can just wrap everything up really quickly. And so to summarize, so why Flutter? It's a very tight integrated development environment. It's one code base targeting both platforms. What's also nice is faster platform iterations where you have a bug, you can fix that bug, and you can roll that out to iOS and Android very quickly. And it's easy to talk to native platforms if needed. And at the end, we'll talk about that regarding native integrations. Yep. All right, so Flutter for Android developers, this is documentation that I wrote on flutter.io/flutter-for-Android. And it took me like a month or something where it was just very in-depth, and we won't get really in-depth here because it will take a long time. But it's about, for example, how do I use retrofit on Flutter, right? It'll tell you how. How do I make REST API calls in Flutter? It'll tell you. How do I do async tasks? How do I do, what's an activity in Flutter? It'll talk about all that. So in this talk, I'm just going to briefly touch on a few points and just explain a high-level concept, and then you guys can go ahead and learn more about it. So common Android patterns, fourth one's missing. Typically, what you run into is async tasks, intents, and activities. When I first started Flutter, these are the three things that I wanted to know how to do on Flutter, right? Because coming from Android, these are the three things that I'm using all the time, right? Like there's no other, more used code than firing off intents, making async tasks, and just creating new activities, right? That is the basic of your app. Now, sure, you got fragments and stuff, but at the simplest core app, this is what you're using all the time. And so an async task, really, in Android, on Flutter, you don't really need it, right? There is a method called compute, where you want a really, really long-running task, and but other than that, you don't need to do async task in Flutter. Why? Because Flutter is managing that. It's a single-threaded environment. It's kind of like Node. Anyone use Node here? Right, a lot of people, right? It's a lot like Node, right? And so when Flutter is running, it's handling all that for you. Now, if you throw a lot of process-intensive stuff, just like in Node, if you have a lot of blocking stuff, it's going to stall. It's going to stall here too. So that's when you use this compute function, where you just pass in a function to compute. It will, spawn a different thread on the device, do whatever, and then return you back the result. Apart from that, you don't need to worry about multi-threading or set run on UI thread, all that stuff. Just do your processing, return the result, and as long as you return it properly, and you tell Flutter that something has changed in your data, it'll work, right? Next is intents, and intents were the most complicated thing for me to wrap my head around when I came to Flutter, because I'm just like, how do I call another page, right? This is the most basic thing, and I can't figure out. And the way Flutter did it is really adopted this universal pattern. What Flutter did not want to do, even though it's Google, is say, we're going to have our own intent mechanism, because that's not what you do in iOS. iOS, you have a whole different way of doing it. And so Flutter adopted this global web way, right, which is routes. Everyone who's used a website built an API or anything knows about routes. It's just like /hey/by whatever, and that you should go to that page. And so Flutter has this idea of a navigator, and that's what a navigator controls which views to show when you're on a certain route. It's very, very simple. So what I'll show you, just some code here. There's a really great package called Fluro, F-L-U-R-O, Flutter. Yes. So I recommend everyone use this package versus doing it yourself in Flutter, whereas you can, but this package really wraps it up in a nice API, and I really want this package to just become, just the default thing that you have to use on Flutter. And so all you do is you create a handler, and you say when a user goes to /users/ with the parameter ID, right? So if you think about intents on Android, you're passing in some variables sometime. In the intent bundle, you're saying, user logged in, so this is the user ID. Now this user ID is going to be passed to the next screen, so that screen can take the user ID and do something with it. You can do exactly that in Flutter using the routes. So you can say router.define /user/user ID, and when in my code that route is call this function called users handler. And then that function users handler is called, and all it does is return a user screen, which is just your Flutter basic widget. And so that essentially is the easiest way to do intents, and you can pass in data. Now, if the complexity, I guess, here comes in when you want to pass in some serializable data. So on intents, you can pass in, for example, like an image, right? If you're crazy enough, you can take a whole image, make it into a byte array, and pass it through if you made it serializable. You can't do that. The router really is taking simple strings and formats. So what you can do is you can either save that image somewhere, and then the next screen can read it. So you're kind of limited in that sense, but most of the time you typically shouldn't, even on Android, shouldn't be making your intents too big anyways and passing in lots of data. So it kind of forces you to adopt a good practice. And then when you want to navigate, you just call router.navigate to, right? And you can even define how the transition should be. So very simple, very basic, but you get this really powerful intent mechanism that's really wrapped up. And on Android, it's going to behave how an Android app should behave, and on iOS, it's going to behave exactly how an iOS app should behave. Okay, moving back to my slides, wherever they are. One second. Where'd they go? Right here. Cool. And then activities, and I kind of just touched it on the other one. Activities are just widgets, right? There's no concept of an activity in Flutter. It's just a widget. You're returning a widget. Now, that widget there's this complicated, not complicated, there's this very in-depth thing in the documentation you can read on Flutter for Android developers on state and stateful. Just stateless and stateful, all it really means is, do you want your variables updating when you tell it that something's updated, right? At a very, very basic level. So Flutter, the reason why it works really well and really fast is it's not constantly pinging variables for changes, right? In the old Angular days, and I think even now, Angular does two-way data binding where you say, whenever X changes, I want my UI to change. And it will constantly pull X over and over again. Now imagine if you have like 1 million X variables. It's going to constantly pull all these million variables to see if your UI is changing. Flutter doesn't do that. At a very basic level, at high level, what you're going to tell Flutter is, hey, my variable changed. Can you do something with it? Right? So you put your variables in this function called setState. And so when that happens, Flutter says, am I a stateful widget, which that I should be checking for setState? Yes, I am. SetState happened. I'm going to go and update my variable. And so that is essentially what the activity lifecycle on Flutter. There's no like on, resume, on, pause. You can have it as an app lifecycle, but from in terms of an activity lifecycle, you just have init state when something loads up, and then you have this build function that draws your layout. And when you call setState, it goes back and draws your build function in an optimized way, only redrawing the stuff that has changed. So going to this question of, okay, well, does Flutter support X? Does it support fingerprint sensors? Does it support the next craziest Samsung innovation, which is tracking your eye sensors or something? No, Flutter doesn't support any of this, right? Flutter's job is not to support any of this. Otherwise, the Flutter team will be stuck adding support for every single gimmick that exists out there. Flutter's job is to draw a UI very well and handle your business logic really well. Now, outside of that, if you want integration into different platforms, different features, if tomorrow iPhone 11 comes out with like a tongue sensor or something, all you have to do is write your tongue sensor plugin inside of Xcode and tell Flutter that, hey, something changed, right? It's via a message bus. It's a very elegant concept where Xcode, iOS or Android just says, hey, I have a plugin, something happened in it, right? And your Flutter app can react to it, and there, you have integration with this tongue sensor or any sort of a new sensor comes out, any database that is just native only. Now, if everyone downloads this app called, it's a very ugly app, but it is called, I keep forgetting the name, okay, it's called Crypto Shadow. So on the Play Store or iOS Store, Crypto Shadow. It is not my app, and I'm sorry to the developer that I called it ugly, but it's a very weird looking app, but it's a Flutter app, and if I were to tell you that it was a Flutter app, you wouldn't know. You would just install it and you would say, this is a very unique looking app, and you would use it and it would look nice, right? And Crypto Shadow, the reason why I tell anyone to download Crypto Shadow is they really did a good job of breaking the mold of how a Flutter app should look and customized all their components, right? And the buttons look weird, the charts are kind of odd looking, but it's like this extreme example, this very avant-garde example of how a Flutter app can look. And it's using the hottest thing around, which is crypto, and it's showing you charts on Bitcoin and watching the markets bleed and stuff. So it's a very nice app. So does anyone have any questions regarding Flutter? Because now we can just do Q&A and just keep talking about stuff.
You said you were going to say where the Flutter name came from.
Yes. So the Flutter name came from here. It's a very, very anticlimactic story. These guys needed a name, and so they said, hey, we need a name. Google Legal, I guess, has this long Google spreadsheet, I'm assuming, list of names of companies they've acquired, and Flutter was one that they had acquired a long time ago, and they said, great, we're going to use that, right? Very, very anticlimactic, and I said, this looks nice. And if you actually look up Google acquires Flutter, it's like an article from 2012. It's some touch sensor company that they acquired, but that's where Flutter comes from. Yeah.
What's your hunch on when the release is going to be? Is it Q1 of 2019?
I think we're in RC now, right? I think we're in RC1 now, so it should be soon. I think it's going to happen when they have like a Flutter conference, which typically happens at the end of the year, but nothing's been announced yet, so it's probably going to be like March of next year, though I could be wrong. But that's typically when they happen, either in October or sometime in February or March. That's when the conference happens.
What do you think is the biggest roadblock between now and Flutter?
I'm not sure. I've been looking at, I've been doing Flutter a lot, and I haven't seen any big roadblocks that happen yet. I think there's just some issues around how to do localization really well, maybe just cleaning up the UX there and how to do accessibility stuff there. But apart from that, I don't see any big glaring bugs that are happening. Yes?
Is Flutter as fast as Force as fast as native or faster or slower?
Depends. It is. I'm going to say it is as fast as native. And the reason is, think about Flutter as just Unity, right? Everyone's played games here. The way games are built is almost all of them use this thing called Unity. And Unity just doesn't interact with native. It just redraws its own thing. So the performance is controlled by the Unity rendering. So your Flutter app isn't really dependent. It's dependent on your phone's performance, but it's really not dependent by some sort of like framework or Android-specific code on that system. It's just done whatever that rendering engine's drawing. So it's going to be fast, and you won't know if you download Crypto Shadow. You'll see that you'll just be like, this is just like an app, right? There's nothing special about it. So it's imperceivable to see, like, this is a Flutter app, this is an Android app, unless you make that clear. I saw some questions. Yes?
Have you gotten any feedbacks from developers that code is really hard to read?
No. The code, it looks like Java code. The code looks like JavaScript code. The feedback you get is when you're writing your layouts, they can get very, very dense. And that's really about breaking it up. Because I know from Android's point of view, when we write XML files, we're just writing these layouts. XML files, we have a nice UI editor. On Flutter, you're just writing your code there. But what you can do is what I do, and I think that they recommend this too, is logically break up your build function into components, right? Methods, I mean. And so if we go back to the sample app we have, right? What I could do is I can have a little function that says show text, right? And that's only going to deal with the stuff in the middle, right? Then I can have a function that says show fab, and that's going to do the floating action bar. Then I can have a function that says show app bar, right? And so those three functions can be composed into one big function inside the build. And then if I want to just edit my action bar, I know where to go, right? And so what I typically do is I break up my widgets that I'm going to use commonly across the system into a file called common. It's a static file where I say common.getFab, right? Common.getXYZ. So I know that once I make a change to this widget, it can affect it everywhere, right, on my screen. So there's just some strategies you can take to make that code more readable. But other than that, it's really just how you architect the code, right? If you really think about it, you run into the same issue on Android if you make your entire app in one activity, right? It's going to have the same exact issue. Yes?
Why use static methods as opposed to making widgets?
Widgets are immutable, right? And so the easiest thing what you can do is just make it a static widget. There's no reason for you to have a new instance because at the end of the day, widgets are immutable. And so you can just go return this widget, and they'll handle it. Any other questions? I saw some hands. No? No one gave the popular question about why not React Native. I get this question every single time. Okay, so I'll just say, why not React Native? Okay, the difference between React Native and Flutter is that Flutter controls the entire rendering engine, the whole UI. And so the performance is really, again, dependent on how Flutter's engine is working and everything. React Native is really around running V8 on the device and taking the JavaScript coming in and saying, hey, if button, then emit, and I'm running on Android, then emit an Android UI button or iOS button, right? And so you're getting, I don't want to say, you're getting native in both sense, right? You're getting native components on Android, you're getting Flutter components that are drawn natively on Flutter. Now, what happens, and a lot of people run into this, has anyone done React Native development here? One or two. A lot of developers run into this, and I don't know if both of you ran into this too. So this big company that contacted me that they were talking about Flutter said they had built a React Native app they're now like a big movie studio too, and so for one of their movies. And it did not work well because they had tested it really well on iOS. They had tested it well on all the Android phones they had, but the padding and the drawing and stuff on different phones that they ran into, like HTC and stuff, was off, right? And they ran into a lot of issues there. Whereas Flutter, it will look exactly the same everywhere, right? And so they said Flutter makes a lot of sense for us because it cuts down a lot of QA time. We don't have time and money to really look down, get all the phones in the world and make sure that it works. And their markets are very different than just a typical North American market. They're becoming a movie studio now, so they have lots of different places that they target. And so different phones have different weird paddings. I remember when I was doing native Android development, the Samsung phones had all sorts of weird issues. Whenever I dropped in a button, it was just like some random padding space, and there was always edge cases that I added in my code to make sure that my code looks the same, my UI looks the same on certain platforms. Whereas React Native, you're not really able to do that. You're just saying, great, I'm going to style this button to look exactly like this, but then you might get some extra padding somewhere else, right? And then in terms of performance, again, you're dependent on the device's performance. On Flutter, you can dependent on device and the Flutter rendering engine, but that rendering engine is optimized to run smoothly on these devices. Yes?
Have you found any challenges with doing UI automation?
I haven't done a lot of UI automation. Flutter has a good testing framework built in called Test. I think it comes built into the project whenever you start a project. If you go to the test folder, oops. Yeah. And so you can do a lot of UI automation here. What you can't do yet, and I could be wrong, is you can't like run an emulator and have buttons get clicked and move page by page. I don't know if that exists, or even if it does, I'm not 100% sure at all, and you can look that up. Actually, why don't we look at it right now? UI automation Flutter. Oh, look at that, Flutter's testing. Let's see. UI. Yeah, I guess they do. The Flutter driver provides an API for recording performance traces from actions performed during the test. So if you're familiar with Selenium, Espresso, or UI automation in iOS, it's equivalent to those integration testing tools. So yes, Flutter has a whole testing suite like that. I thought it was just very code-based, but you can do UI automation tests really well too. Yes?
You mentioned we could do this iteratively where we don't have to convert the full app.
Yes.
So if I start by doing one feature in Flutter, but then that feature needs to navigate to other features within my app, would I need to basically build a native router that...
Yeah. You would just build a plugin that's specific to you. That's like, go to this page, and then that page, on Android, it would be like a callback that's like on message, and you would read that message and you'd be like message.go to page X, then you start an intent and go to that page.
Can that accept parameters and stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Any other questions before we're all hungry and want to eat lunch? Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to leave my Twitter here as well as my email. If you run into issues with Flutter, if you have questions, you can meet me here, or you can just tweet at me and I'll help you guys out. Awesome, thank you.